Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Jen Hicks. I am the Director of Communications and Outreach for Maine woodland owners. We're based in Augusta, but we work statewide. We support woodland owners in Maine, most small woodland owners, primarily under 1,000 acres, but we work with the large guys as well, as far as sharing information and providing resources. And we also have members who don't own woodlands and but believe in supporting an organization that do support woodland owners because they are the front lines of our forest conservation efforts in the state. Tonight we have the honor of having two very interesting people presenting a very interesting topic. The first presenter is Lloyd Irland. He is been a very loyal writer for our newsletter, Maine Woodlands, and recently has been curating authors and writing for our climate series that we've been including in our Maine Woodlands newsletter. And this is stemming from the several things. One, the Maine's effort to address climate change through their climate council that was established by the governor last year, and there's been a lot of work around developing a plan for the climate change in the state through this council. And we are on one of the working groups. Our organization is well represented on the lands working group. And the other thing is that we have a lot of woodland owners who have shown interest and have asked a lot of questions about monetizing essentially and measuring our carbon storage in the forest, and maybe an opportunity for another way to promote maintaining forests for climate change as a way to, as another product for the forest, for forest land. So we are offering this seminar as kind of a companion to our articles that we've been putting in our newsletter. And thinking is that if there's enough interest, we will actually do this a few times. Because it can get pretty dense, we are understanding that we got to probably provide small doses of this information each time. So tonight's event is an hour. We will have another one in June. That's going to be a little longer, talking about the different projects in Maine on creating monetizing and measuring carbon on our lands. But tonight we're going to be focusing on the kind of the nuts and bolts of understanding carbon in forests. So I'm going to leave it as that because Lloyd's and Denny are way more knowledgeable than I. Denny Gallaudet is also here with us. He is a landowner who actually went through the process of measuring his carbon, figuring out how much he could sell carbon credits for. He's actually been featured in our newsletter in June. And so I sent you the article that he wrote. And so he's here to answer any questions you might have about the process, kind of a on the ground experience opportunity. So he's been wonderful to work with. He's been a great way for me to understand the realities of this. And so I think it'll be really useful for you folks as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass this over to Lloyd. Lloyd is also a forester. He's a consultant. He's a writer. He's an economist. So he's got a very interesting blend of background and ability to convey. He's a great writer and a communicator. So I haven't really put one label on him. I don't think it's possible. But this is definitely something he's been a great help with me on to get this information out to our members. So Lloyd, thank you for being here today. I think he's going to go through this slideshow pretty quickly and give his 101 on this topic. We will create time at the end for questions, but if you have questions during the presentation, you can send those questions through chat, or you could raise your hand like this, and I'll acknowledge you and see if Lloyd can take a break and answer your question. So this is a small group and it won't be very hard to manage, but I want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered and get the information that they're looking for tonight. Okay, so Lloyd, it's all you.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you out there in Zoom land for turning up on a delightful summer evening. So you're about to enter the alternative universe of forest carbon. And this is Dr. Irland's famous 3-step plan for carbon owners. As I was putting this thing together, it hit me. We're talking about people who are carbon owners. How many of you have ever, hold up your hand, how many of you have ever thought of yourselves as a carbon owner? You are a carbon owner, and there's Danny. He has definitely thought very hard about being a carbon owner. Okay, next slide, please. Carbon owners, come right in. The markets are booming. New sales plans are coming out daily. There is no blue book. Sales commissions are very high, and the paperwork is endless. Next, please. Isn't that a great picture? It's the Wild West out there, a frontier. Mountebanks, charlatans, card sharks, land hawkers. Next. Try Dr. Irland's famous time-saving 3-step plan for woodlot carbon credits. The gentleman of the upper right corner, actually, is a very distant relative of mine. My grandfather's middle name was Barnum. So here's my 3-step plan. Study Irland's iron laws, which are coming soon. Study, discuss, and answer the screening questions below. Then run the numbers. And I've got an example coming. Coming soon to a webinar near you. Next, please. Outline, a little more formal now. Motivation and scope. Why are we doing this? Then we're going to review Irland's iron laws of forest carbon. We're going to go over the screening questions, and I'll show you a mock-up of the first calculations that you would do. I'm going to talk a little bit, if we get to it, of the tensions in forest carbon growing, which are different than the tensions in growing traditional wood products. Next, please. Motivation. Well, carbon owners have been supplying co-benefits for free for all generations. Now they're aware of a brief boom in what is called carbon markets. We had a brief boom about 10 years ago, and now there's a boom of interest for a whole lot of reasons. A young Swedish lady named Greta Thunberg seems to have touched off. Climate is all the rage now. That and a few hurricanes and droughts and fires. The state of Maine, along with many others, has ambitious CO2 reduction goals, and they have a working group, as Janice said, considering programs for forests, for how forests can contribute to this. I'm not going to go through all of that stuff. You can read that a lot of different places. We all know the forests are important to the carbon balance. But for members of SWOM, for woodlot, for carbon owners, what might this mean for us? Next, please. There's some jargon. No need for me to read this at you. If you have a copy on your own laptop that you can look at and keep to one side, you may find some of this jargon unfamiliar. If it's difficult for you, I'm going to try to avoid building this around the jargon too much. Okay, next, please. Step 1 in Irland's 3-step plan. Master the iron laws of forest carbon. The first one is you get paid for wood when you cut it, and you get paid for carbon when you don't. I don't think that's been sufficiently emphasized with people. And I used to give seminars. I've got copies that I'd love to send you because they're kind of fun, to finance gurus on Wall Street back in another life who had heard a lot about forests. They thought forest carbon would be something they could make some money out of. And it was really interesting to sit in a room full of people who had never had a forester in the room before. You get paid for wood when you cut it, and you get paid for carbon when you don't. You've got to keep that in mind before you start. You don't get paid for doing what would be profitable anyway. You have to be doing something beyond what would be profitable already. And you don't get paid much for temporarily storing carbon. The big programs, which you'll probably hear about when we get to that point, the official compliance carbon markets require that you tie that carbon up for 100 years. Now that's what's happening this year, the 200th anniversary of the state of Maine. So half of the amount of time that the state of Maine has been independent is the amount of time that you have to tie up your carbon if you're going to be in the compliance market. So just think about that. 1920, 1820, 2020, 2120, you're looking ahead 100 years. You don't get paid much for temporarily storing carbon. You don't get paid for good intentions, for being a good person, for wanting to preserve wildlife. And the key thing is, and a lot of people fail to understand this, if you manage, anytime you manage a woodlot for one single goal, whatever that goal is, whether it's wildlife habitat, pleasant scenery, a place to walk, if you have only a single goal, you give up something else. Okay, next please. Still more, a carbon credit, and this is just another way of saying what I just said. A carbon credit is a sale of cutting rights to someone else. When you sell a carbon credit, you've sold the cutting rights to those trees to someone else. Now, we'll market all kinds of ways, all kinds of people who might acquire those cutting rights from you, and that's what you hear about later. This is a lot like a conservation easement, only it applies to the standing timber rather than the soil. Another way to look at it is it's a partial liquidation of your inventory. In tax terms, is depletion. It's kind of a return of your capital. But the interesting thing is you can sell part of your inventory without cutting it. That's an idea that might be attractive to some people. Okay, let's proceed. Next slide, please. Now, one thing that's interesting is that nice logs, really good logs, sell for a lot more than pallet logs and pulp logs. But a ton of CO2 sells for the same amount of money, whether it's in a ton of biomass or it's in a veneer log. So CO2 doesn't get more valuable the bigger the tree gets. The wood does. Okay, next please. Step 2. Okay, you've heard step 1 of Irland's famous three-step plan. It's now famous because all of you guys have known about it. Step 2 is answer the screening questions, and I have a short list. After looking at Danny Gallaudet's article, talking to other people, thinking about, how do you talk to woodlot owners about this? Well, there's so many moving parts, all this stuff. I think the best way to do it is to start with some screening questions. And if you answer those screening questions in a sensible way, then you get deeper into the details. So screening question number 1 is, are we in tree growth? Which is a way of saying, do I have a fairly current inventory? Do I have a management plan? Am I following it? Now, we have found out by surveys and conversations with forest landowners that some forest landowners are not following their management plan. Even a few of them, in a piece of interesting work that Don Manzius at Forestry did, can't find a copy of their management plan. That's somewhat dismay that I have to report this. So the question is, if we're not in tree growth, for whatever reason we have, how might we ever be ready for a carbon credit sale? Question 2. Whoops, can we go? What's our forest general condition? Is it recently acquired, heavily cut? Actually, Mike is on this seminar, and he wrote a nice little article about some property he acquired that was just like that. He told us in the article what he was doing with it. He heat his house with his improvement cuttings. Is it a property that's had long-time ownership but no real management? My favorite example is when I was working for the conservation department, one of the foresters took me out on the public lot, and I believe it was Garfield Plantation, way north, way up on the Allegheny River. And he said, as far as we can tell from stumps, from records and everything, this public lot has not been operated at all since the 1920s. And well, you can see that a woodlot accumulates a lot of things, including big shaky hemlock and other problems if you don't do anything with it for a long period of time. Is it in good shape but young? Birch-level stocking is not there yet, but what is there is good species and is in good shape. Does it have a history of management with maybe 2 cutting cycles behind you already and a lot of really good quality saw timber that's growing well? Other aspects of the condition of the forest. Okay, next please. How much carbon do we have? I hope you can see this a little bigger on your screen. I usually tell people to be more careful, but basically I've got two charts there which show average live tree tons of carbon per acre at age 55 from a U.S. Forest Service source. The middle one is oak hickory. It's somewhat like what Denny has, I think, on his woodlot. The one to the left is aspen and birch. You don't care about the numbers, you just care about the relative heights of these bars. And then you have oak hickory in the middle, then oak pine, then spruce fir, and then white red and jack pine. These are the averages according to a Northeast-wide study that is done by the U.S. Forest Service for the purposes of facilitating carbon accounting. We often use these numbers to illustrate the concepts we're trying to express, even though we would not apply any of these numbers to a particular woodlot. The one on the right, I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go by if you want to take a look at that. MAI means, that was on the jargon page, mean annual increment. That's how many tons of carbon per acre at age 55, this stand, which is basically simulated after a clear cut, starting from age 0. Generally, you cannot sell all of this carbon. You can't sell all the carbon that is shown in this leftmost slide. You can sell part of it, and there's some rules about that. What I'm trying to do right now is steer away from all of those, from getting down in the weeds until you've gotten through the screening questions. So how much carbon have you got? Okay, next please. What are our larger goals? Is it important that this remain in one piece? And I use our here because a family forest is usually a family proposition or a husband and wife. It's an our kind of a woodlot. Perhaps there may even be heirs and a variety of stakeholders or co-owners in the property. Is it important to us that it remain in one piece? Is there an estate tax liability coming down the line? Well, for all of us, there is, truly enough. What is the importance of future income or the ability to cover taxes? Are we prepared overall in our financial picture with our assets for any unpredictable or considerable financial need, or any predictable one for one reason or another? Firewood, do we supply our own firewood? Okay, I think I've duplicated myself there. Next, please. What? 100 years? That's what the compliance market wants. If you're going to get paid full price for carbon, you have to enter into an agreement that amounts to cellular cutting rights that will last 100 years. Well, there are plans around, and you'll hear more about those later. Would 20 or 30 years be realistic for us or not? Now, again, if tree growth tax is not realistic for you because of the time commitment, then maybe you're not really ready to look at carbon either. Next, please. Are there other ways than a carbon credit sale to achieve our long-term goals, the goals of our ownership, of our family, of the people who care about this property? Would a conservation easement do just as well? Should we just donate it outright to a conservation group? Should we create an LLC with shares going to the heirs to avoid breaking up the property into pieces? That's been done. Are there other things that would achieve our long-term goals other than a carbon offset sale? Okay, next please. Now, that's your list of the second step of Irland's famous three-step plan. So you have to think about those questions yourself, discuss them with the people who have a share, a stake. And if you are still interested, if you say, this is still worth pursuing after we've thought through all those screening questions, do the suggested readings. Now, I think I've got the suggested readings. Did I put these suggested readings in here, or do you have those, Jen? Oops, you've muted yourself.
Sorry, I don't have the suggested readings.
Okay. Well, there are some that we will make available that take the next step, that get you beyond this stage. Now, if you end up saying, gee, based on thinking through these screening questions, we don't think we need to know anything more about this, then you can spare yourself reading those things, and you can spare yourself, what was it, Danny? It was 124 pages of fine print in the one of the programs that you could take advantage of if you tried to do a carbon sale. So then, if you're still interested and you've done the suggested reading, go to step 3 of Irland's famous forest carbon plan. And that'll be next page. Next page, please. This one here is still in development. If I was a lot more clever and had some more help, I would take this screening table and I would have it in front of you right now, and I'd be able to email it to you, and you could do it yourself. I plan to try to get that done this summer because I've gotten a little bit of help, and I'm going to need some input and review from some savvy people, such as some of you who are on this webinar now. We will actually probably pilot test this thing on people who never even attempted this to just see, well, is it clear? Is it understandable? So the place where you'd start is with, what do I have in cords per acre? And you can work this up on a per acre basis and then multiply it times how many acres of land you have that is expected to be actively managed. Many woodlots have 100 acres or so, but they don't expect for one reason or another to actively manage all 100 acres. So whatever that active management is going to be. What is the baseline? Now, there's a thing called a baseline that gets you into the details of the product, of the programs that enable you to sell your carbon credits. And Denny can mention the best baseline if he likes, depending on the questions that might come up. Then you subtract your inventory, you subtract the baseline from your inventory, and that gives you an excess over the baseline, which is kind of a regional average, and that gives you what you could sell. Now, if that number in line 3 is a big number, then proceed. If it's not, or if it's negative, then you might as well just put this aside, go read a book or take a walk or do something else. Go out and enjoy your woodlot, because you're not going to have anything to sell for a carbon credit. Now, there are some other ways to go about it, but again, that gets us too deep into the weeds again. Now, then, if you have an appealing number in line 3, then you can get a rough estimate of what the value per cord of this wood is. I'm just speaking of cords just to keep this simple. Obviously, it's cords, board feet, tons. There are all different kinds of products. I'm trying to keep the measurements simple. If this were to be really technical, it would get a lot harder to understand. But we would provide a lookup table that would, in fact, for row 2, says go to lookup table A. We would develop that lookup table and have that'd be the next page of this little sheet. And for number 4, we are thinking of some kind of a county by county weighted average stumpage price that you could then go to the lookup table and just copy it in here. Then you multiply them. And then what you have to do is you have to go from cords to MTCO2E. And if you get into this very far, you'll know what that means. That means metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And there are factors that will tell you for every given species how you go from a cord to how much carbon dioxide is in the core of that wood. Then you can take that amount of carbon dioxide and pick a number, multiply it by $10 a ton. What does that number look like? I just picked $10 a ton rather randomly. Some of the compliance markets have been paying more, but unless you have a lot of tons and are willing to make a really long time commitment, you're not going to be in the compliance market. So outside of the compliance market, there are ways to sell carbon credits, and those values per ton are all over the place. But I just picked $10 just for fun. Then you can say, well, how much would it cost me if I took a partial cut, or how much money would I have in hand if I took a partial cut right now, say 25% of my volume? And compare that with what the value of the carbon is, and ask yourself, am I better off doing a partial cut right now, improvement cuts, improve my woodlot, and continue to harvest the growth in the future X years, or am I better off with a carbon sale? This is an extremely simple-minded way to help guide you through as a screen for whether going into the details of how to do a carbon project is worth your while. Okay, let's see, next please. Now, if you end up going through Irland's 3-step plan and you figure you're really not interested, then you don't really have to know the stuff that I'm talking about now. But I'm going to talk about a few things that'll give you some background before we then turn to questions and to some remarks from Denny. This is the same set of numbers. These are the numbers from the spruce fir. This is in tons per hectare. It doesn't matter what the units are. Tons of carbon per hectare. Now, this is a chart of what it goes from year age 5 to age 55 to age 125. 125, that's a long time. This is spruce fir starting to stand, basically having the clear cut. And why it has a positive number there is because there's downward debris, standing dead trees, there's a forest floor, there's carbon on the ground now, even though you don't have any live trees, okay? So up goes your yield curve. And so very commonly people say, oh, well, we can grow more carbon, just leave the trees alone. And that's true. In fact, it's very hard to grow more carbon on a stand by doing anything with your forest. The way to grow the most carbon is to leave it there and let those trees get bigger. And we have a lot of species, we don't even realize it anymore, but some of our species can grow till they're 300 or 400 years old. So by that standard, 125 years is nothing. For the typical forest we have in central Maine, for example, or especially northern Maine, 55 years, a lot of the stands might be that, but 125 years is very old. What if you have a stand that's 55 years old now? If you kept it for another 70 years to 125, you will gain 75 tons more of carbon that's stored there. Now, then the question is, what happens next? Will that stand break up? Will there be a wind throw? Will there be some other event? We don't know where that curve goes, so we might not want. We do know that if it is not disturbed, if there was no hurricane, no gypsy moth outbreak, that is likely to continue to grow if at a slower rate. Next, please. Now, the growth rate of carbon depends on where you start. So if you're starting at age 15, say you have one of these young stands that was heavily cut and has almost no merchantable volume on it, the annual growth rate, the MAI, the annual growth rates are high because the stand is young, it's gaining in height rapidly, and the trees are expanding rapidly in diameter, and they're filling the site. And so you have, for the coming 60 years or so, you have a high rate of growth adding of carbon. If you're starting at age 55, which is the orange line, your growth rates are naturally lower because this is an unmanaged stand. We're not thinning, we're not doing anything that would affect the growth at all. So your mean annual increments shrink and they steadily trend downward. They stay positive for a long time, but 70 years from age 55 would be that age 125. Next, please. Now, here's an example of something that I think is very interesting, and that is that once we get a stand to a well-stocked condition, some species allow you to harvest wood and maintain a very high inventory. I would have made a nifty chart for this, but I just didn't have time. You look at the leftmost column, says residual stand. What you can see is that by age about 95, 100, that stand is carrying a residual stand that doesn't change very much out to another 50 years. And yet they're cutting wood. They're cutting wood. Now it takes, as you said, you have to wait till you're 95 or 100 years. It takes a long time to build a stand like this. Now, this is typical red pine. There's something like 250,000 acres of red pine plantations in the lake states in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And when I was a kid, I used to, at scout camp, I used to thin a red pine plantation with a Swede saw. So it's kind of like red pine. Takes a very long time, but these stands, I've got a picture here. Next slide, please. These stands are money machines. This is a stand that's in central lower Michigan. It's in its 40s. It's on its second thinning, and you can do mechanized thinnings. They're already getting saw logs, so they've got good saw log markets nearby. And these stands will grow a cord per acre per year of nice straight red pine logs, and you can do a 10 cord per acre cut every 10 years and still have a lot of wood and a lot of wood growing. So this is real. This is not a theory. And this can be, I think, a tremendous way to sustain a fairly high volume of carbon on an acre at the same time as you're harvesting wood periodically to pay the taxes and to pay the administration expenses and to support a local industry. And some of that wood could go into timbers, decking. In fact, red pine in the Midwest is used for decking as a substitute for southern pine. And it serves very well on that purpose. A lot of other sort of structural purposes. It's also a lot of the smaller materials used for pulpwood. So if you like red pine, that's pretty cool. Now, I'm not recommending necessarily that we plant red pine in Maine. There are pathological and other concerns that I hear. Maybe Mike or someone else would have any observations about that. But the concept is, if we back up one slide again, if we go back, that an analogy with this, I think white pine, well-managed white pine stands can do this. There's no question about that. There may be some other softwoods. We have exotic large plantations. It could be managed this way if people would just take the trouble to do it. And that would be very interesting if we could probably identify some hardwood stands. The trouble is so many of our hardwood stands don't have enough really good crop trees left after a century of mismanagement to really lend themselves to immediate regular incomes of high value products. What you have to do is a cutting cycle or two of improvement cuts, where most of what you're getting is the occasional small saw log pallet wood and pulp, and so your returns aren't all that appealing. But it can be done if you have the patience, or if you bought it from somebody who did have the patience and it was already in good shape. Okay, can we skip ahead to? So step right up, folks. Try the famous 3-step plan. You'll be glad you did. Thanks for coming. Have any questions, comments, or outbursts? Are there any palms raised there, Jen?
Not yet. I don't see any hands raised yet.
Okay, so this was all just as clear as it can be, right? You love the 3-step plan. Let's talk to Denny about what he thinks about the 3-step plan, and maybe give us a quick summary of his experience in trying to go through this. Denny, it's yours.
Yeah, great. Go ahead, Denny.
I'll just take 5 minutes or so. So I had already gotten through the first step, Lloyd, of your plan. My property has been in tree growth. When I bought it, it was in tree growth. So I was locked into the every 10-year update with the forester. And the last time this happened, I was using 2 trees. Wayne Millen was the forester at the time. And I said, can you tell me something about carbon with this plan? So he did a timber inventory, which you need to do. And I found out I had a lot of carbon already sequestered in this property, and it was growing quickly. Just to give you a dimension, because I'm an environmentalist, the average Maine household around here emits about 20 tons of CO2 a year, from heating, electricity, and so on and so forth. And my woods is sequestering that amount of carbon on only 4 acres. So it's a pretty dynamic situation when you come to figuring the climate impact. But I'd already done the tree growth plan, and I found out that taking a look at the compliance markets, I'd gone sort of 80% of the way there already. You have to have your boundaries, you have to have the soils, and so on and so forth. And what was missing was what Lloyd has been describing, is get an actual precise inventory of the amount of carbon that's on your land and its growth. In my case, because I have an oak pine forest mostly, Lloyd, and it's probably 90 years old at this point. It's one of those properties down this way, which was hayfield back in the 20s and has been growing since then. And so there's 2 ways that, I'm just going to finish with this. There's 2 ways that if you want to sell carbon credits in addition to or alongside of, which I do, harvesting wood for firewood and selling some saw logs, you have 2 ways you get paid. And the first is you get one very large down payment, which is when you first enter into this kind of a transaction, whether it's a compliance transaction or a voluntary market, which will pay you for the amount of carbon that you sequestered over the regional average. And you can look that up. My stocking was about twice the regional average. So my carbon sale as a down payment before expenses came out to $1,200 an acre, which, given the fact that forest land is now selling for around $500 an acre, it seemed like a pretty good, a pretty good amount of money. It was not quite as much as the total stumpage value, but it wasn't far from that. And so what you do is you enter into this contract and you sell it, and you get that money up front, and you have to pay expenses, and that's a problem I'll just wrap up with, which is an impediment in all of this. And then as you go forward, as you move forward, you have the option of either, as Lloyd said, either having a harvest and selling the wood as stumpage, or selling the retained carbon as carbon. So you have a supplemental income stream. And so that's what got me interested in this. I'll just finish up by saying that, as it's mentioned, there's been a significant number of very large carbon deals in this state, compliance deals. The Passamaquoddy tribe had almost a $15 million initial down payment for their proposition, the Nature Conservancy, and so on and so forth. So their deals have been done on very large acreages. The problem is, as you get smaller, there's a lot of compliance costs. They're in the compliance markets. Foresters have to come and look at the work the first forester did, and so on and so forth. Plus, there's very few people in the Northeast that have this skill. So I kind of ran into a roadblock on the compliance expenses, and have put things on hold. But I learned a lot in doing the project, and I look forward to a time in which there will be, the capacity, the professional capacity to make this easy. I analogize to the solar array situation, which 10 years ago was a very abstruse situation. It was expensive. And now we have a number of solar installers in the state. And if you've done a project, as I have, they come in and say, okay, we'll put up this solar array. And now do you want to sell the renewable energy credits also? And renewable energy credit is the same thing as a carbon credit, except it's electricity. And they say, well, and you say yes, you check a box, they take care of it for you, and the money begins to arrive every month. So I look forward to a time when that might be possible for small landowners. So with that, I'll quit.
Well, thanks for those personal observations and experiences, Danny, and we appreciate you writing them up for Jen's publication, because a lot of other people, I think, will benefit from them.
Yeah. And I will say, I don't know much about this. Maybe Mike, Dan, did you want to do any general comments about what Maine Woodland Owners is doing around carbon and forests, or is that something that's not fully baked yet and something we don't want to discuss at this point? What's your?
I would think there's not too much to talk about yet. We're in the very early stages of determining whether, just as Denny was, do I have enough extra carbon or extra quarts per acre over the regional average to make it worthwhile to consider pursuing a carbon offset, carbon credit project.
Yeah. I think the idea is there's no, easy answer to the question. It's an easy, it's a basic question, can I get my woodlot involved in a carbon credit scheme? And I think just based on Denny's experience, I realized the other part is infrastructure. I was stunned by the reality, Denny, that you really couldn't go to the final line, the finish line, and because there were no real evaluators available. I mean, that's an industry that's part of the industry that hasn't gotten anywhere, it sounds like, and it makes it very hard for anyone to fully participate in this program.
Well, here in the Northeast, that's the case. And the large carbon deals have been done by brokers, from the West Coast, because it's the California compliance market. So I did talk to some people in California, but they were wanting to fly out and so on and so forth. It gets pretty expensive. If there's a little bit of time, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the 100-year commitment, which is kind of forbidding just this 100 years. I think that's a little bit, I'd like to unpack it a bit and to say that, when you join the tree growth plan, you're in it in perpetuity until you get out. There's no time limit on tree growth. And the way you get out is you pay a penalty to get out. And that often happens when people decide to sell their land to the developer. The developer will pay the tree growth plan. That penalty, that happens all the time here down here in Southwest Maine. Now, similarly, you're in the compliance program for 100 years, but you can get out at any time. You just have to pay the penalty. So, and the penalty is a little complicated, but it's certainly doable. And you'd be willing to pay the penalty if the value of the stumpage got to be a lot more than what you got when you paid, when you got the sold your carbon credits, and you could afford it. It made it economically advisable to do so. So, I think it was more helpful to me to think of the carbon program as sort of a parallel to tree growth. Both of them have long-term commitments. Both of them have periodic compliance costs, but you can get out any time, paying the penalty. So I just mentioned that. I would just finish by saying, the commitment to tree growth passes as this would with the generations. If I pass this on to my kids, they inherit the tree growth plan, and they have to pay to get out of it. Similarly, with the any carbon deal that I do.
This is a great time for anybody to jump in with questions you might have about this or an experience you've had.
Denny, did you get far along on the project to know, you mentioned the $1,200 per acre perhaps up front, but did you get far enough along to know what the verification costs were going to be to you over that 100 years?
I didn't get quite the last part of that question, Mike.
What were the verification costs going to be for you over the 100-year period?
Well, it's as far as the California market, there's a recertification every 6 years. And of course, in tree growth, you have to pay money to continue your plan every 10 years. So, but every 6 years, in addition, they have to, in addition just to looking at your plan and having it be a relatively reasonable cost, you have to have someone come in and check out the inventory and make sure you haven't, overcut, that you're maintaining your actual carbon. So it basically means you have to do a quickie inventory every 6 years. And now, what does that cost? Around here, $40 an acre for or 40 acre, let's see, no, $40 a plot is about what foresters charge. So it didn't seem, it wouldn't have to be a very large number, but it's definitely there.
Okay, so from that, you're in one of the voluntary markets then?
No, I'm on hold. I actually wrote up the application and figured out. So I'm all ready to go if I just submit my plan to one of the let's see, one of the clearinghouses. There's 3 clearinghouses, and then I would have to arrange for a third-party certifier to come in and check out all that work and charge what it would cost. And the initial pricing I got was just way high, and it struck me that it was because these were people from California. There was no folks on the ground here in Maine who were willing to do the work. So, but we'll see what happens. It's just labor intensive work, and the cost should come down. I think, but we'll see.
Danny, what market would you be in if you were fully?
I think I would. So the compliance markets, so the voluntary markets, we know around $7 or $8 a ton, and until recently, until this pandemic kind of slowed things down. I'm sure it will bounce back, but that was $18 to $20 in the compliance market. And I think that's the thing that landowners might want to keep an eye on, because it seems to me that the carbon markets, for the reasons that we see here in Maine, the people trying to meet climate goals and so on and so forth, that price could go up. Over in Europe, they have a cap and trade carbon market, which bounced along at about $10 a year, and then all of a sudden went to $30. So I did it for the fun of it. I'm kind of following the markets, and if the price of carbon in the compliance market goes up to 30, there's going to be a lot of Maine landowners who might conclude this is equal to or more than the value of the wood as stumpage. So it's a pretty dynamic and interesting situation. But I would go with the 100-year deal, recognizing that you can get out anytime just by paying the penalty.
Go ahead, yes, sir. Yeah.
I'm confused by the difference between voluntary and compliance.
Okay.
I can certainly take that.
You go ahead.
Would you like to, Denny?
You want me to? Well, the reason that compliance is used is in several markets, Europe and California, there's a cap on carbon emissions in California companies. And they have to keep their carbon emissions coming down, or they can buy carbon offsets to make up the difference. And that can come through forest projects, through, for methane projects and so on and so forth. But because it's meeting a legal obligation to the state of California, it has to be rigorous, and that's why it's called compliance. So there's a compliance market here in New England through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's one in Quebec. There's ones in Europe, as I mentioned, there's one in California. The voluntary market doesn't have these legal situations, and an example would be, Colby College has declared itself carbon neutral. They still have some emissions that they haven't eliminated, so they buy offsets, from various people of various types every year and pay cash for it. Some of which are carbon offsets, and they're less rigorous. So the time scheme can be longer or shorter, which it typically is, and the price can be lower. So that's the difference.
Thank you.
Might add, the voluntary market is very large, and I think it's growing over time. There are a lot of companies that don't have a very good way to just cut emissions quickly, but they'd like to do something that shows a commitment. Partly of it's for corporate reputation purposes, part of it's because they really do want to be part of this rather than standing aside. Some companies want to get started with it because they can see down the road that the rules are going to get more stringent. The requirements for emissions reduction are going to get more stringent. And sometimes it's smart to just get going rather than just fighting it and waiting and fighting it and waiting it, and then having to make a lot of adjustments right away. They call it in the trade anticipatory compliance. In other words, if the emissions limit is 5 milligrams per liter of something, well, set yourself up so that you could be at 3, because you're pretty sure that the day will come when the rules will come down to 3, and then you'll be ready, and the people who aren't ready will be in difficulty. But you can look at there are big market reports that try to take stock of this voluntary market. There are many, many actors in it. And some of them are legit, some of them are not. There have been essays written about some of them that don't seem to really be real after you look at them closely.
One really startling one that's now, of course, been blown away by the problems we're in now is JetBlue in January announced that they were going to make all their US flights carbon neutral by July 1st. And they were going to do it by buying offsets. And if they bought forest carbon offsets for all of it, it would have been 70% of the annual sequestration of the entire Maine forest.
Wow.
So
that's pretty cool.
And Amazon has put in $10 million and so on and so forth. So these big corporate buyers could influence the market pretty sharply.
I know there's some academic institutions which will offset the carbon footprint of their graduation ceremonies. Right.
Yeah.
Flying in all the travel, they'll estimate what that is, and they'll buy these credits from carbon brokers that actually make available carbon offsets, which they've in turn purchased from people like Denny and other people who have marketable offsets that can meet the requirements.
There's another, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So how short a period can these voluntary contracts be? Is there any limit? Can they be annual?
Lloyd, I don't have an answer to that. Do you?
Well, I've been told by people who've been closer to it than I have lately that there are some that'll go to 20 years, but that's on the early end of it, and very unlikely that there'd be many that would go any less than that. The whole thing is, the way I analogize it, the reason for the 100 years is you have to actually keep carbon out of the atmosphere for a very long time, because it's called an offset for a reason. It has to be the actual equivalent of emitting 1 ton of CO2 less from the smokestack of a power plant or a boiler system. And it can only be the actual equivalent of cutting emissions if it's stored in the forest for a very long time. So if it's only stored for 20 years, then it's not really offsetting somebody's emissions in a meaningful way.
So Denny, what would you recommend to foresters who are beginning asked this question about setting up their woodlot so it could be considered for offsets? Do you feel like foresters are ready for this, or is there something that they need to do to prepare for these questions.
Yeah, it's a chicken and the egg situation because the landowner really can't move forward unless they have a forester who's able to put this, this arithmetic together. You start with a timber inventory, but then you have to use the estimating equations that Lloyd mentioned, which are complicated. You have to do some forecasting. It's all there, but it would require an investment of time to do it. And I just, I think as often said, people, if I can do it, anybody can do it. And it just takes a little bit of time to push through it. And if you're a trained forester, I think you should be able to get into it pretty quickly. I know a few foresters who say, well, I have a client with 1,500 acres and he's considering a carbon deal, who should he talk to? Blue Source or one of these people, that are national scale. And I try to encourage them to see if they can work into it themselves and figure out how to put it together.
It gives me an idea, Jen. I think one thing that maybe ought to be on SWOM's, on Maine Woodland Owners' list of policy recommendations, both for itself as well as things that the NWL group should suggest to the council, is that human capital. Denny says that human capital is a significant limitation. Now, years ago, back in a former life, I used to do a lot of training on carbon markets and procedures and how it's all done. And we could get the people that are actually doing this stuff now, and we could put on a series of short courses or something that could enable a small number of foresters. It wouldn't take many, half a dozen, to get homeworked up and qualified and basically certified with the marketplace to perform this kind of work, and get them over that initial hump of learning the procedures and all of the ins and outs.
Just in that regard, Lloyd, I've stayed close to several of these deals, that larger deals that have gone down, of the 100,000 acre category in Maine. And so that's a multi-million-dollar upfront payment, typically. And the people that put those together charge a 30% commission upfront.
Mm.
So there's a large payoff for the people who can get their hands around those transactions. And it's interesting to me that resource hasn't sprung up in our area.
Well, one thing that's interesting too is they say in the safety accident world that close calls are telling you something. I know that there have been several large carbon deals worked through, and then the owners decided against, after devoting considerable amount of attention to seeing what could be done. I don't know how many there are or what all of the reasons were, but and I'm talking about large deals, large amounts of land, large amounts of money. And certainly lessons can be learned from those things. But I'll tell you one thing that's been something I've observed all along is that when we speak of a voluntary carbon market, one of the first things you discover when you look at an individual deal is that the terms and the payments are confidential.
Yeah.
This is not a transparent market. Denny may be close to some people. He maybe gets some anonymous tips from people he knows or whatever who will tell him things. But I don't think he could publish that in the newspapers and would not betray confidences. But I guess I have a viewpoint on this because many years ago I worked on the Chicago Board of Trade, where every trade on the Chicago Board of Trade was by open outcry. Every trade is recorded. Every trade is on the tape. There's no secret deals. There's no trading on the sly overnight. And when you look at that kind of a market, everybody knows what the prices are for every grade of wheat every single day, every single hour. Well, in this market, it's not realistic to even call it a market. It's a series of one-on-one deals, and there's very little in the way of a tradable asset that gets resold, which would enable you to have real market price discovery like you'd have in the wheat futures market. So especially for the big deals, a lot of people do not want you to know what the terms and what the prices were. A little bit like a friend of mine who was an appraiser used to say, he says, don't tell me what the price is. He says, tell me what the deal is. And that's how I know. But I think that's not our big worry right now. Our big worry right now is trying to figure out what kinds of properties could work with some sort of a carbon transaction. What will some of these new ideas that are coming along, the project that Danny referred to in Vermont, we don't know much about it. We plan to learn. And other people are thinking about ways that people with less than 100,000 acres might be able to be part of this.
Right. Well, we've hit our 8 o'clock time end there. And but if there's a last minute question, any other thoughts before we finish up? Well, I appreciate those who made it and weren't swayed by the beautiful weather, beautiful evening. This is recorded, so this will be on our website. So if you wanted to review any of the information, you can. And also this slideshow will be on our website as well. So you'll have access to the information that Lloyd has on those slides. So, and Lloyd's available, I think, right? I'm going to put it out there that you're happy to have any questions sent your way, Lloyd?
Sure,
Okay.
that'd be good.
So I'll make sure everybody gets his email address, and Denny as well. I had put your email address on the article, so.
Good. Thank you. Happy.
So I'll put it on there as well. Thank you everyone for being here tonight, and we'll hopefully see you and more next month at our next carbon and forest conversation. So
Thank
have
you.
a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long, Danny. So long, Mike. So long, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Great.
So long.
Good night.
Good night.